So I want to talk now a bit about the mechanics of Dena'ina language. I don't expect you to be an expert on Dena'ina language as a result of this class. This class is not a Dena'ina language class, and as I've repeatedly tell you, and will probably tell you a couple more times before this lecture is over, you really ought to go take a Dena'ina language class, whether that's through one of our many Dena'ina tribal organizations or the Dena'ina Language Institute, or whether that's through UAA or KPC. You ought to take a language class. We have many fantastic language instructors. Denita Slauson, we have Joel Isaac, Andrea Ivanov, Jennifer Williams, Professor Peterson, many others, and so the point here is you have plenty of people you can learn from, and so the point of this class is not for you to become fluent in Dena'ina or even to be able to speak Dena'ina at all. However, I'm what's called a sociolinguist or linguistic anthropologist, and I'm very interested in the connections between language and ways people think and how language reflects our culture, right? For example, it's endlessly fascinating to me that in American English we oftentimes call things like plants and animals and soil, quote, natural resources. And I do it too. I think most of us do that, depending on, not like all the time, but in certain kinds of contexts when we're talking about policy, for example. And yet, at the same time, that's a decidedly sort of settler-centric way of referring to these beings, right? Especially who in many indigenous cosmologies would be relatives, and I try to remember to use other kinds of terminology and diversify how I speak about animals. But yeah, right? Like, I'm fascinated by how culture and language are related to each other and how language reflects cultural meanings. So my point in talking about mechanics of Dena'ina language, and also my point in having you listen to that Boris lecture on Dena'ina grammar, is not that you become an expert in Dena'ina grammar, which you would need to take classes in, but instead that we might just kind of point the way a little bit, kind of gesture in the direction of some of the ways in which Dena'ina language reflects Dena'ina culture. So with that in mind, let's jump into it. First of all, just a little bit about sounds. There are about, is it 42 or 52 morphemes? That means different types of sounds that the human mouth can make. No language uses all of them. Every language the human family has invented represents a partial sampling of the many, many different sounds that our mouth can make. And many of these sounds, if you are not from a language that uses these morphemes or these sounds, they can be both hard to hear and hard to pronounce. So for example, in Dena'ina, you have the barred L, or what I always call the aspirated L. It's a little bit like making an L with your tongue against your teeth. We call that alveodental. Making an L and then breathing through it, which sounds very odd to an English speaker because we don't do that. But here is what the sound sounds like, sort of. I always look super weird when I make barred L's. I kind of have to like move my mouth to the side, which is kind of a sign that I didn't grow up doing aspirated L's and instead picked it up as an adult when I started learning languages like Navajo and Dena'ina. So the aspirated L is a sound that our mouths, if we grew up speaking English and not something like an Athabascan language, might feel very unfamiliar. Another example is the glottal stop, which in Dena'ina we represent with this apostrophe. You've probably seen this in Dena'ina words if you've been paying attention during the Kalifornsky readings or just otherwise seen Dena'ina words, or for that matter, the word itself, Dena'ina. So the glottal stop is basically a signal that your mouth is supposed to pause for a second and change direction with a vowel, or sometimes with a vowel and a consonant. And so English doesn't do this a lot unless you speak certain kinds of English from England. So let me give you an example. Pretend you're saying bottle like some people from England say it, bottle. So don't actually pronounce the T, but just bottle. It's almost like your mouth, it's almost like the air in your back of your throat did like a 90-degree turn from going up to then going sideways. And so you kind of did two sounds right next to each other without having to break it up with your tongue, without having to treat it like a new syllable. That's called a glottal stop. We do it very seldom in English, so you're probably not used to it. It's extremely common in Dena'ina, and in fact, that's one of the points of maybe debate's too strong of a word, but sort of like discussion of how you would pronounce Dena'ina because of the glottal stop in there. Should it be Dena'ina or Dena'ina, right? With the apostrophe being a glottal stop. Another example of a sound that we don't really do much with in English, a type of morpheme, but which gets a lot of attention in Dena'ina, is what are being called here back feelers. Back feelers are languages you make towards the back of your throat without really using your tongue. You probably don't think a ton as you're talking about where you're putting your tongue or lips, like for letters, unless you've maybe need to for some particular reason, such as you're speaking in a second language. But many of us, we don't really think about that day by day, like, oh, here's where I put my tongue for this specific letter, unless we've had to intentionally try to speak in a certain way. But linguists can chart how we make different sounds, like B, right? B, b, b versus D, da, da, da. If you actually pay attention, it's your lips moving versus your tongue being at the back of here. We call those dentals. And then we have our alveolars, laterals, palatals. Palatals are made by putting your tongue to the roof of your palate. Front velars, back velars, right? So it's a matter of where you're putting your tongue sometimes, as well as where you're moving breath through. Some letters even kind of coming way down here in Dena'ina. So Dena'ina does, to put it overly simply, a lot more with the back of the throat than English does, including these back velars. So let me give you an example. Ka, ka, that was the letter Q. That does not sound like k, q, q. In English, it sounds like ka, ka, or h, ha, or gh, ha. None of that really sounds like the way you think it would sound in English. It's a back velar. So that's different. It's a sound that you may not be used to saying, and you may not even be used to hearing. And indeed, people oftentimes when they're listening to foreign languages sometimes find it hard to distinguish between phonemes that they didn't grow up listening to or making. B and V can be really hard for people that come from languages where B and V are not distinguished, and lots of languages mix B and V. They're very, very similar. B, v. So, by the way, the back velar, just to make this like slightly more complicated, the back velar also changes how some vowels sound. So, for example, U, if it's right by a back velar like Q, not only are you making a sound at the back of your throat, but that U now changes. Normally, this U would be an U sound, but next to the Q, it becomes K-O. K-O. Partly because if you were to do K-U, it would sound really funky. So if you're trying to say it fast, and so instead you kind of drop your mouth more than you normally would, so that you can properly get the air out from what you were doing. At least that's how I like to think about it. It's sort of the vowel getting adjusted to what the consonant's up to. So it's an interesting and distinct thing. I also in Dena'ina, so if it was like a Q apostrophe I, it like, instead of E, which the I often makes an E sound in Dena'ina, instead it becomes like a I, kind of like an I, just an I sound in English, but also kind of like an AI sound almost. So back velars change your vowel sounds. Now again, this is not something that somebody would have to think about consciously if they grew up speaking Dena'ina. However, if you're learning Dena'ina as a second language, this is something you have to remember. But if I was able to learn this, you can learn it too, because I would, for somebody who claims to be a linguistic anthropologist, gosh, would I say I don't necessarily always pick up pronunciations that quickly. So it's something you can pick up, but it's just to suggest again how complex languages are, and there's so much going on in our brain at any given moment that we don't even realize, right? And so much of it is sort of muscle memory of our mouths. So the more you say it, the more natural it becomes, right? And the more you get used to it, and the less you have to think about it. It sounds very, very different than English, and it is a beautiful, incredible language using all sorts of morphemes that we don't do anything with in English, which I think is really fun and really exciting. It's part of that rich tapestry of different sounds that we have come up with. I think it just is a testament to cultural creativity. A few aspects of Dena'ina grammar that I find interesting and that Alan Boris talks a lot about in that video I had you watch that I'll just briefly touch on since he covers it in much greater depth. The first is that languages typically have an order of how a sentence is supposed to go. That doesn't mean a sentence always has to go that way. It's just how a sentence usually goes. And so, for example, in English, we do subject, object, verb typically. So, I ate cheesecake, right? The I is the subject. Subject is the person doing the thing, or the entity doing the thing. The active agent, in this case, the force of action. The object, or the verb, is obvious, the action, right? In this case, eat. And then the object is if it applies, it's the thing that had action done to it. So in this case, cheesecake had eating done to it. So I eat cheesecake. The Yoda in the Star Wars movies, people oftentimes sense that that's not the way English normally sounds. It's because he's oftentimes mixing object before verb, which doesn't sound quite right to English ears. In Dena'ina, it can go different ways, but generally speaking, it goes subject, object, verb. So that's different than English, which is interesting. And now, before I talk about these other things, though, I want to jump forward a slide and talk about a theory that you may have probably heard of before if you've taken other anthropology classes, and if not, that's totally fine. I'm going to explain it to you in about 20 seconds, or probably a minute. There's a theory called linguistic relativity, or as it's sometimes called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It's named after Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf, who were two really well-known linguistic anthropologists in the mid-20th century. Benjamin Lee Whorf, this very dapper gentleman, and his mentor Edward Sapir, both were writing about this idea of how language shapes how we think, potentially. Whorf, in fact, called one of his most famous papers the relation of language to habitual thought. And one of his ideas was that the ways in which we conjugate a verb, the way in which we discuss certain concepts, the way a language forces us to construct a sentence, that actually can cause us to think differently. He did a lot of work with Hopi language, and so he was focusing, for example, on the fact that Hopi language deals with time in kind of a different way than English, and he drew a big contrast between how European languages think of time as this like linear thing that proceeds at a certain rate versus sort of Hopi ideas of time. And that work's been sometimes criticized as overly simplistic, but the bigger idea is what we need to focus on, the idea that how we use language the structure of language, not just the terms we use. I think we all agree that the terms we use can have effects on our thought, right? If you call animals natural resources all the time, that's going to potentially lead to a more utilitarian economic kind of view of animals. But rather that even the grammar of a language affects how we think. There is actually some evidence for this. I could get into all sorts of different studies about that. It's a particular passion of mine. I just want you to know for now what the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is, and that there's pretty good evidence to suggest that not all the time and not in sort of a really deterministic way. It's not like the way you speak must be the way you think, but that certainly the languages we grew up speaking do have kind of subtle and interesting effects in certain things, especially in how we like visually perceive the world. So with that in mind, the idea that language can sometimes have sort of subtle influences on how we think, we should also add that it can go the other way, and personally I think it goes the other way a lot more often, which is that culture, our meanings, our ideas, our worldviews show up in the way we do grammar, show up in the way we do nouns, show up in the way we structure our languages. People bend their languages around their thought patterns. So whether it's languages shaping thought or thought shaping language, either way there's a connection there, there's a reflection there, and we see that all the time, and we've got good evidence for it, and you definitely see it with Dena'ina grammar. So one example of that is that I want to focus on is groupings in partnership, as he talks about in the video I had you watch. In Dena'ina, you have a way of doing, so with verb stems, you have a lot of times a verb stem for if you're talking about one or two people. Like you would conjugate it differently, you would say it differently, the verb, but you kind of have a one-person version and then a two-person version, and then you have a three or more people version. So whereas in English, right, we have like I, and we have we, and we have you, but like there's only one kind of we, right? It's we whether there's you and me, or there's we whether there's you, me, and the rest of the entire nation of the United States. It's all we. In Dena'ina, it's different if you're talking about a two-person we or a 3 to a billion people we. And so Boris points out in the video, I think it's a good point, that this seems to, I don't know if it shapes, I would say more reflects a sort of peculiarly Dena'ina way of looking at social life, where it's partnership over and over again, right? We talked about this last time. The chiefs had partnership relationships with each other. Slosin villages were paired with each other and relied on each other within that paired. This decades-long trading relationship between chiefs. Moieties, they were paired together and helped give potlatches for each other's deceased members. Selden relationships, where, two women that are best friends and gather together all the time, or men that are best friends and hunt together all the time, and are expected to mourn for each other very publicly if one of them passes. So moieties, self-send relationships, close-in alliances between villages and between Geshka. Not to mention, in the stories, the ideas that the animals have certain pairs, that the plants have certain pairs, that certain animals go together, like this one and this one go together. So that, as he says, roses and devil's club go together, right? So these ideas of a pairing seem to be reflected in the language itself, where we treat a we of two people as fundamentally different than other kinds of we, right? That's kind of a special kind of group, a groupness that is the pair, which is kind of a base social concept. This is all sounding a little bit Levi-Straussian and structuralist, if you're familiar with that body of theory. But I think there's a lot of weight to it. I think that that's not a bad theory for why Dena'ina is structured in that specific way. It's certainly the best one I've heard for that unique aspect of Dena'ina grammar. It also talked about in the reading, or in the video, this idea of animacy, and that sometimes the way that so Dena'ina verbs up to this point are super polysynthetic. Polysynthetic means, synthetic means like made out of, poly means many, so made out of many things. Polysynthetic languages are languages where words, and particularly verbs, have lots and lots and lots of pieces attached to them. So in Dena'ina, what that looks like is that the verbs have lots and lots and lots of pieces attached to them. So whereas in a language like Spanish, a verb can really only be conjugated so many ways, right? And in English, there's even fewer ways, right? English is a pretty basic language when it comes to verb conjugation, of confusing language when it comes to verb conjugation, but a basic one. We oftentimes have one way to say a verb that other languages would have 2 or 3 or 4 ways to say it. Anyways, so like, for example, were. All right, were can be we can say that for the past tense for was, for both a generic individual as well as a collective group of people, right? Or a collective group of animals, or a collective group of objects. English is pretty laissez-faire about our verbs. Dena'ina is almost the exact opposite, in the sense that there are so many specific ways that you add different prefixes, different things before the verb, to make it clear exactly what's going on with that verb, which is fascinating and really a whole subject to its own. So it's very polysynthetic. So a single Dena'ina verb has all these different pieces of information attached to it. And as a result, the thing that one of my Dena'ina language instructors, Jennifer Williams, like to say, she says, a Dena'ina verb can be an entire sentence. And that's very, very true. And you see this in a lot of different ways. One of them is that there's a way of marking a prefix that marks if something's animate. And as was talked about in the video, you would use that for human beings, but you'd also use that for dogs, and you would also use that for crucifixes, like Russian Orthodox crucifix, Christian crucifixes, right? Christ on the cross. And so the implication being that certain holy objects have a presence to them, an animacy to them, shows up in the language. Noun shapes is another good example where you have to clarify with certain nouns what kind of shape it has, its roundness, its straightness, things like that. I don't think anyone studied this with Dena'ina language, but with Navajo language, close relative, down in the Southwest, it has been shown pretty convincingly that doing that conjugating your verb in a certain way when you're talking about a certain shape of object, right? If you're saying like, pass me the round thing, that the word pass has to have like a part of speech that basically says the round, pass me the round thing. Anyways, that doing that with your verbs actually causes people to see the world more according to shape than just by other kinds of perceptual categories, so to be more attentive to shape. There's also aspects which, yeah, it might have been a little confusing in the video you watched, but basically there are lots of, you know how in English there's like the past tense and the present tense and the future tense, and then also the opiative tense. So we can say things that used to happen or did happen, things that are now happening, things that are gonna happen, or things that we hope that'll happen. We've got a few different tenses. Dena'ina's got several tenses and several aspects, and as a result, oftentimes with the aspects get oftentimes very specific into like, how is the action happening? So for example, is the action happening repeatedly? Is the action happening one time in the past or many times in the past? Is it still happening? Did it happen sometimes in the past? Did it happen all the time in the past, right? So like getting very specific. And indeed, some dialects of English actually do this as well in more complicated ways than sort of English. More generally, like some dialects have developed more of that because English doesn't do it very much. So for example, African American Vernacular English, some of the first research that was done on it showed that far from being sort of a more basic or impoverished form of English as it was often being stereotypically and racistly caricaturized, instead African American Vernacular English, or as it was called at the time in the 90s, quote, Ebonics, actually has an extra aspect or tense that kind of standard American English doesn't have. In the sentence like "Cookie Monster be eating cookies" was the example that was done in the classic study with like a school kid that was showing this like tense, but basically like the ability to say somebody does something and they do it very often. So that's not a conjugation that most dialects of English have, but does have in African American Vernacular English. It's not grammatically incorrect. Instead, it's actually conveying a type of tense that other forms of English don't have. So my point with that, bit of a diversion, sorry, is that Dena'ina has all sorts of aspects. So there are very precise ways to talk about motion and time and space and how things move in time and space. I find that fascinating, and I think it's fair to say, as Gary Witherspoon has argued for Navajo language, I think we could say similarly for Dena'ina. I think that this probably suggests a language and a worldview where motion and space and time are all very, very important to think about, and especially sort of the ways in which things move. Which makes sense for indigenous groups closely tied into the land who ultimately were hunting, fishing, and gathering groups, right, to be incredibly focused to the ways in which things move, but an emphasis on motion and an emphasis on verbs. Whereas English is oftentimes a huge emphasis on our nouns, an emphasis here in Dena'ina on verbs, action, and how actions get done, right? Very precise ways of saying that a view of the world is sort of constantly in flux and in motion. And I think you see that reflected in the stories, right? In the sukto, in the traditional stories, where so often there's this idea of things transforming into other things, of change and flux, or even of entities being, as was talked about in the video, sometimes good, sometimes not good, right? There being kind of more of this ambiguity and movement between different things. And that is what I wanted to say about Dena'ina grammar. I don't have a great way to end that topic, so the end.